Hi, I'm Casey, and today I'm going to talk about my June wrap-up. I'm not sure if you can hear it in my voice. In fact, I'm actually positive that you can hear it in my voice that I've been really fucking sick for a week. My husband and I, unfortunately, finally caught COVID for the first time, and it has been just miserable. So this is going up a little later than I would have liked. And the only reason I'm filming it today is because I have a whole bunch of library books due. And I need to talk about them in this, so here we are. Okay, so if my counting is right, I finished 14 books in the month of June. I DNF'd 2, so that's a grand total of 16. I ended up listening to a lot of audiobooks. I sort of found this groove where I started playing World of Warcraft again, and I was doing all the daily quests and all the various quests and all the different zones while listening to an audiobook, and it ended up where I was just plowing through my Libby backlog, which was really great, and I'm very glad that I ended up doing that this month. And I ended up not reading a lot of physical books this month. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about these. I'm going to talk about these in the order that I finished them, so from the most recent all the way back to the beginning of the month. I don't know why, it's just how I decided to do this when I was taking notes. I'm pretty sure I was still a little feverish when I was taking these notes, so we'll see how well this goes. Okay, so I feel a little lucky because the last 2 books that I read were my 2 DNFs. They were really easy to put down and just say, you know what, I'm not feeling these and I'm not coming back to them. So we're just going to talk about these really, really quickly. The first one is Summersense by Lee Mandello. I picked this up because of the Goodreads Best of Horror for 2021. I had heard some kind of mixed reviews about this. There are a lot of people that really love it, a lot of people that felt very middling on it, and a lot of people I think that didn't really enjoy it. Unfortunately, I'm in the last category. I DNF'd this at like page... I actually wrote this down in my notes. Why am I looking here? At page 40. Page 40. I got so far into this 370 something page novel. Unfortunately, I didn't really like the writing. I didn't really give any shits about the characters. There's a lot dealing with like grief and a lot of anger surrounding that grief in here, and I just didn't really find it compelling or interesting. I think it came on a little too strong at the beginning, and unfortunately for me, I couldn't get over it enough to kind of push through to the end and see if it sort of made up for it. The other thing that I felt about this was, even though I was only 40 pages in, I felt like I was starting in the middle of a series. This felt like book 2 in a series, or even book 3 out of like a 5-part series. There was so much of this that was built off of the relationship between Eddie and Andrew, and you don't see any of their relationship by the time you come into this book. Eddie's already dead, and so it's banking a lot on this sort of overwhelming grief and the overwhelming anger that Andrew is dealing with, but it doesn't give you a lot of context for it, and I think it really just kind of ruined and soured this book for me. I should give you a synopsis real fast. This is following Andrew, who his best friend Eddie has just seemingly committed suicide, and Andrew is going off to the graduate school where Eddie was living at the time, and he's kind of following in his footsteps. I think there's going to be I think there was a lot that has to do with, like, drag racing and cars as this goes on. Andrew also can see dead people, and it's kind of hinted at that Eddie can as well. That's about all I know of the synopsis of this one. I'm not sure where all it was going to go. This just wasn't the book for me, and I DNF'd this. This is kind of an honorable mention because I DNF'd this on the 1st of July. But I started reading it, like, I think in the middle of June is when I started this, and I was just having such a difficult time with it. This is a little rambly. I'm sorry. I don't feel well. My next DNF, and my last DNF for the month of June, was Cherish Farrah by Bethany C. Morrow. This one follows 2 young women who I believe are in a private high school, one named Cherish and one named Farrah. They are both young black women, and Cherish's parents adopted her when she was really little, and they are very wealthy and affluent white people. And Farrah's parents are less well off than Cherish's, and they are struggling some financially, and so they end up leaving Farrah with Cherish and her family for a time. I DNF'd this, I think, at around the 33% mark. Yeah, just check my notes, it was at 33%. For a number of reasons. I didn't like anything about this one. I hated the writing. I did not like the characters. I didn't like any of it. There was this line, and I can't remember it exactly, but it was something about, there was something going on. The main narrator is Farrah, and she's talking about this boy that she has a crush on, and he does something, I can't remember what, something fairly innocuous, but that it just makes her kind of swoon a little bit, and it was something, and then the line in the book was like, he did this, and I practically began ovulating. And it was so weird, especially whenever you consider that it's supposed to be like a 16, 17-year-old girl writing this, and it just, I've seen, there's a lot of the praise for this book talks about how much it deals with manipulation, and unfortunately for me, I found it to be so heavy-handed in that aspect. The way that Farrah discusses, you know, the way she talks to her mom or to Cherish or to anyone else from the school, and Cherish's parents, it was so overwrought and just overwritten and so heavy-handed in, like, how manipulative she was being. And there was nothing subtle about it, and I thought it really took away from any story that really could have been there. And I don't normally dislike unlikable characters. One of my favorite books of this year, A Touch of Gin, has two extremely unlikable characters at the forefront of it, but this was just, I feel like there's got to be like something grounding that character a little bit, and there was just nothing grounding Farrah in here. She was just constantly trying to manipulate everyone in these really overhanded, overplayed ways that were just working out. It was very strange. I didn't like any of it, and I was listening to the audiobook of this, and I got to the 33% mark, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. This was after I was sick, and I was like, I'm not gonna push through the rest of this just to say that I finished it. So I DNF this one as well. The next one I have is Sula by Toni Morrison. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. This one is following a entire community of Black Americans in the early 1900s in this this community that they've built called the Bottoms, and you're following a bunch of different characters, including the titular character Sula, and you're seeing as their lives kind of intersect, and as they all have an influence on one another, and as time moves forward and how everyone grows and impacts everyone's life. This was really so beautiful. It was really beautifully written. There were so many times in this story where the author would use some language that I just completely wasn't expecting, and it would be really shocking and really jarring, but like in a good way, you know. It really, bleh. One second. So I feel like a theme for my reading in the month of June was I would read one book that would do something really well or would do something not well at all, and then I would pick up another book later on that month that would kind of do the inverse, and it would, you know, do the same thing except it would do it better or it would do it worse, and I would have these like really great comparison pieces that I could really show that, like, oh, this thing I hated in here, it's done really well in here, and this was no exception. I thought one of the things that Sula did so well was its use of language and its use of, you know, curse words and, you know, this really shocking language. It would really, you know, kind of bring you back into the story and really make you think about what was happening, versus this one in particular, which just uses a lot of fuck and shit and ass and all this kind of stuff. That it just felt like it was for shock value. It's like, again, I only got 40 pages into here, but there was so much of it that a lot of the times the language felt like it was only there to show that, like, oh, Andrew angry, so he's swearing and he's cursing at everyone. And it would just be less impactful overall because of it. But in Sula, it wasn't as, I guess, prolific or as constant, and it would really be so surprising when it would happen, and it would really show you that this was a moment of desperation for some of these characters, and it was so well done. It was so beautifully written. This was the first Toni Morrison I've read, and I can't wait to read more of her work. The next one I have is Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction by Michelle Nijhuis. This is nonfiction that is discussing a lot of the history surrounding conservation, particularly conservation in the Western Hemisphere, and the efforts that have been made and the people who have made these efforts. This was really, really fun. This is another one that ended up being 4 stars for me. I picked up the audiobook as well as reading some of it physically, and one of the things I loved so much about this was it took this kind of unflinching look at the people involved in conservation. And so one of the early ones in here is talking about, you know, white men in the Americas in, like, the middle or late 1800s, and them trying to conserve bison. Not because of the impact that bison had on their environments and their importance to their ecological systems, but as a method for preserving toxic white masculinity, because they felt like bison deserved to live purely to be hunted by white men, because that's what you needed to do to, you know, prove your manliness and your worth. And it really held back no punches in discussing the flawed nature of the people who started conservation movements. It talks about eugenics in here and the prevalence of eugenics in conservation movements. It was really, really fascinating. It was really interesting. I guess I should just end with that. The next one I have here is Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. This is another one that I picked up for the Goodreads Best of Horror for 2021. I really enjoyed this. This ended up being, I think this is 4 stars on Goodreads for me, but I think this is far closer to like a 4.5 star. This follows a young woman who, Sophia, I couldn't remember her name, and it starts off with Sophia was made for him, and you're following her as she and her husband are living in this gated community, and in here you get some of the rules for the gated community. Yeah, and so you get to see some of the contract for this. And it takes kind of a strange turn, and it gets a little weird, and that's almost always a recipe for success with me. I love when shit gets weird. I love when shit gets a little conceptual. And this was so close to being 5 stars for me. I think on a reread it definitely would be. I was very surprised at the turn it took. I really shouldn't have been. That was one of those where I was like, I really should have seen this coming. I really should have seen that this was happening. But I really enjoyed it. It was very strange. It was a lot of fun, and I think that this is such a good example of like short, weird horror, and it doesn't try too hard to explain away all the things that happen in here, and I absolutely love that. The next one I have here is This Is How You Lose the Time War. this is one of my favorite books of all time. I've done a yearly reread of this every year after I've read it, and this was the right time to read it again. I absolutely love this. It's absolutely beautiful. You're following Red and Blue, who are two agents on the opposite sides of the Time War, and they begin taunting each other with letters, and then eventually they fall in love. And it's such a beautiful piece of fiction. It's so beautiful. The prose in here is absolutely gorgeous, and I just love it so much. Okay, we're gonna start trying to just plow through these really, really quickly, because I'm talking too much and it's putting a lot of strain on my throat, and that's not fun for me. Okay, next one is Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This ended up just being a 3-star for me. This is a science fiction horror. You're following a small salvage crew. They're not even really a salvage crew. They're just on their last mission out in space. And they find a distress call for this long missing cruise line ship, and they go to do some reclamation and some salvaging. Overall, this had so many of the right pieces, and I just don't think it fit them together very well. I thought the premise was incredible. Some of the characters were decently strong, but I don't think they were really fleshed out overall, and they ended up falling really flat for the most part. There were some really creepy parts to this. I don't think the ending, I don't think that the overall explanation for what happened was really successful. I think if that was the route that the author wanted to go, then there were definitely some places where it could have been changed to be not only more impactful, but also just a little less, I don't want to say preachy, but just a little bit, giving it a little bit more oomph, I guess. So much of this book just ended up falling flat. Part of it is also the audiobook. The narrator's really intense, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but as I said earlier, I was playing World of Warcraft while listening to this, and I'm trying to do dailies, and I've got this woman shouting in my ear about stuff through so much of the book, and through some times where I just didn't think it needed to be that intense. Overall, this was fine. It wasn't anything necessarily bad. I think it definitely leans more on the, on a positive side for me than it does on a negative. This was a bit of a disappointing read, but I had seen a lot of criticism around this book that talked about how disappointing it was, so at least I didn't go in completely blind. The next one is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This was 5 fucking stars. This is another one that I picked up for the Goodreads Best of Horror for 2021. And holy shit, this was great. This is another audiobook that I listened to, and it was so beautiful, and the narrator did such a beautiful job. I think I listened to all of this over the course of 24 hours. It was so compelling, it was so interesting. This is sort of a retelling of Dracula, but through the perspective of the first bride of Dracula, and it follows from when she's turned and when she's made into a bride of Dracula, through him acquiring more wives and more love interests. And so it's really compelling and really beautiful. I really can't recommend the audiobook enough. That was absolutely the way to read this one, and it was so wonderful, and it is one of my favorites from this list on Goodreads so far. The next one I have is Playlist for the Apocalypse by Rita Dove. This is a book of poems. Overall, this was 4 stars for me. This was really, really wonderfully written. There's so many poems in here that are written in a variety of styles, and it really deals a lot with being a Black woman in the United States. My favorite section in here were some of these ones at the end. I thought they were some of the most impactful. Overall, I really loved this, and it was something that I'm really glad that I got to this month. The next one that I have is The Between by Tananarive Due. This was 5 stars for me. This follows a young man named Hilton. I say young, he's probably close to my age. And his flirting with death, and how it seems like death keeps narrowly avoiding him. This is one that was so impactful for me. I didn't expect it. I started reading this back in April, and I got about 15% of the way through, and I was really enjoying it, but it just sort of got pushed to the wayside because I was trying to prioritize other things, and I ended up letting the hold I had on this expire at the library, and I returned it. And I picked it back up this in June just because I was like, oh, maybe I can, you know, finish it, or like maybe it'll be one of those that I'll kind of read 15% at a time until I eventually get to it. But holy shit, once I got, you know, about 25% of the way through, I was like, yeah, I really need to just sit and listen to this one. And this one had such an impact on me. I mentioned in, I think, the mid-year freakout tag that I was listening to this, the end of it, whenever there were people in my house for my husband's D&D night. And I was listening to the end of it, and I was trying so hard not to just, like, sob uncontrollably because there were people upstairs laughing and having a good time, and I was just downstairs devastated, and it had such a strong impact on me, and I absolutely loved this. I thought it was beautifully written. This is a book that you could have told me that it was written anytime in the last 5 years, and I would have believed you. Instead of it being written in, I believe it's the early 90s. It didn't read like it was that old. It read like a much newer piece of fiction. It was absolutely incredible. And if you can get your hands on the audiobook was really, really lovely, and the narrator was absolutely marvelous. The next one I have is All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This was really disappointing. In here, you're following Murderbot as it is trying to, you know, put in minimal effort to do its job. It's an android in a security unit for this group of explorers that are on this relatively unexplored planet trying to do some data gathering, and, you know, some strange and violent things start happening. I didn't like this very much at all. I tried to listen to the audiobook, and I was really struggling with it. It was something that I couldn't listen to while doing other things, which I always think is kind of a downside in an audiobook. And so I grabbed the physical book from my library, and I didn't like this very much at all. I think I need to finally just sit here and commit and just accept the fact that funny versions of certain genres just aren't fucking for me. Anytime something is touted as, like, really funny horror, I usually don't find it funny, I just find it annoying. And it's the same thing here. This is supposed to be, like, you know, really humorous science fiction, and I just found it annoying. I don't like when books completely undercut all of their own tension by just a really stupid fourth wall breaking joke, and that's a lot of what's in here. I was really struggling to read this at all. I was very close to DNFing it, and my beautiful, wonderful, fantastic, amazing husband decided to help me out here, and he read me, I think, a really good portion of this. I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 chapters. He read it out loud to me, and I was able to finish the book finish the rest of the book that night. And it's like, somewhere in the middle here, it starts to get, not necessarily more serious, but it just starts to really lean into what it is and telling its story. But the ending is so disappointing, in my opinion. It's so sudden and so fast, and it was almost like the author, like, I don't know this, obviously, this is speculation, this is just how I felt about it. But it felt like the author was suddenly reaching a page limit that they had, like, set mentally, or someone else had set for them for this, and they went, shit, I have to end it, and it just was like a sprint to the end, and it was so disappointing. This is 2.5 stars for me. It's fine. I'm not gonna continue in this series, and it's a really big disappointment because I really thought I was gonna love this. The next one I have is Nupaming by Leanne Simpson. And the tagline for this one was The Cure for White Ladies. This was a wonderful and miraculous 5-star for me. This is one that is that, if I recall correctly, was basically written as sort of a response piece to this really, really old, sort of memoir from, this white woman who wrote, I believe it's, My Year in the Bush, and this was absolutely incredible. If you can get your hands on the audiobook for this one, I can't recommend it enough. It's very much an indigenous storytelling piece. You have a lot of characters that are all sort of, you know, kind of metaphorically and physically bound up into one character and often represent different pieces of that character, but are also their own unique individuals. And this had bits of not only a narrative story to it, but also some poetry, and just, it was so incredible. It was so beautiful. I really can't think of the best ways to describe this other than listening to the audiobook was like sitting around while someone told you this really important piece of their culture, and just getting to listen to it was so incredible, and it really had such a strong impact on me, and I think about this one all the time, and I'm so glad I got around to it this past month. Going back to charging right through some of these books, because I'm sure you can hear it in my voice that I'm getting tired and that I'm not feeling well and I'm ready to be done. So we have Suffer the Children by Craig DeLuey. This was a 3-star for me. This is following an outbreak of some sort of disease. It's called Herod's syndrome, and it kills all the children in the world. And it's basically like, from where it starts, it just starts traveling east, and it just, you know, slowly goes around the entire globe. And it's, there were a lot of pieces of this that I really enjoyed. I thought it was really interesting, and unfortunately for me, it was so much more interesting in, like, discussing with my husband or my mother-in-law than it was with actually reading it, because I think it asked a lot of interesting questions. I don't think that it explored them all in this novel very well. It explored them, you know, to a good amount, but I think there were kind of a lot of assumptions made, that, I don't know, I guess as, you know, a 33-year-old lady with no fucking interest in ever having children in the slightest at all, it felt like there were kind of like these presumptuous things that were happening, because, you know, all the children start dying, and it impacts everyone, and obviously it has this great impact on not only the economy, but also just people as a whole. And by the time it got to the end, I think that there were just, you know, there were a lot of people who were, you know, much more in my husband and I's boat, that were, like, perfectly willing to sacrifice everything in their lives to help, you know, with Herod's, and it's so weird to talk about without, like, spoiling everything, but there was also, you know, this kind of question of it, like, at what point do you let someone who's died go? And I think that this made for some really good discussions, but overall, as a reading experience, it wasn't perfect, and that's fine, it doesn't have to be, but where it really lost me, and this is so unfortunate, this was like a 4-star book until the epilogue. I hated the epilogue. I don't know if I've talked about it on this channel, but my biggest pet peeve in reading, and it happens a lot in horror, is that, I feel like authors aren't willing to just leave things open-ended, or not answer all the questions that they asked. And this one, the epilogue, I think, just was like, well, we hadn't really, like, definitively said this was what was going on, so here you go. Here's, like, the absolute answer to that question, and I hated it, and I didn't think it needed to be there. I thought it worked better whenever it didn't confine itself so tightly. So overall, this was just 3 stars for me, but if you have kids and you're and you want to read, like, a horror book that will frighten you, this would probably be the one for you. Next one I have is Slewfoot by Brahm. This was a 4-star book for me. This one's following a young woman named Abatha in colonial New England. She is just living her life with her husband, dealing with, you know, the horrible misogyny of the time, and trying to be herself and be, you know, the kind of free spirit that she's just naturally born to be, while also making sure that her and her husband can, you know, live in this puritanical society. And an old ancient spirit in the woods wakes up, and their lives and their fates intersect and intertwine, and it was really interesting. It's another one that the audiobook was just beautifully narrated. I think that the only thing I didn't love about this one was to me, it kind of felt like the climax happened at about 75%, and then we still had another quarter of the book left to really sort of resolve and come to the conclusion, and it was just almost too much time. But this was really beautiful. It was a really fun read. I didn't expect it to be as, you know, sort of bloody and violent as it was at times, but also just really sweet and tender as it was. I thought it, you know, struck this really great balance. Okay, the next one I have is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. This is another one that I read because of the Goodreads Best of Horror for 2021. So earlier I talked about how there were a lot of books that I would read that, you know, sort of like did something poorly or did something really well, and then I would read another one that did the inverse. This was one of the first books I read this month that I thought did not strike a very good balance on, is it real? Is it not? Is this in someone's head? Is someone mentally unwell? Is that what the actual horror is that they can't tell the difference between what's going on in their mind versus what's happening in reality? And I don't think that this one did that balance very well. Versus The Between, which struck that chord and that balance so expertly that I was shocked, and I was along for the ride the whole time, and I couldn't tell what was going on. But unfortunately, in The Last House on Needless Street, which was a 3-star for me, I don't think it did this very well. This book is following, you know, a Bible-thumping cat, a young girl, and this reclusive man who seems to be very shut into his own house and his own life. And and a young woman who has just moved into the neighborhood trying to find her long-lost sister and potentially the person who murdered her. I feel like people say that, you know, things like twists or plot points are obvious, and they often use that in like a negative context. But I think if you're only looking to be shocked by something, you're often missing really strong and good storytelling that can happen whenever you know what's happening. But if it's told perfectly, or if it's told really well, that can be just as good as being surprised, right? And so I don't want to say that like, oh, all the twists and turns are really obvious even from the beginning, because they were, but where it didn't fail at executing those because it was obvious it was heading in that direction. Where it failed is just it didn't tell that story very well. And I don't think it did a lot of justice to this kind of, is this real, is this not, element that a lot of horror authors play with, and I think a lot of horror authors play with better. I will say this has, I don't know, it's kind of, okay. So I do want to just go ahead and warn you that there is, some discussion of dissociative identity disorder in this book, and it's unfortunate. This is spoilers, by the way. You should probably put spoilers big on the screen right now. Unfortunately, it happens a lot in a decent amount of horror where that particular struggle is utilized as a twist, and it's utilized, you know, to make someone out to be a bad guy. And I do want to say that one of the things that this book did do right, in my opinion, is that it didn't use that to make someone be a bad guy and be like, oh, look, one of the people in your system is this horrible person. It didn't do that, which is great. There are a lot of people that do just lean on that, and I do appreciate that this book didn't. That it it did use DID as a twist, but it didn't use it in the way that it's often used. It did subvert some expectations in that capacity. That being said, the other twists to kind of account for that, I don't think were very successful, at least in my opinion. I don't think that they had the same kind of impact that they should have, and it just felt like the author had this really good intention of subverting that expectation, but then they had to come in and do a bunch of different things to make it work. And it just didn't work for me entirely. Overall, this was 3 stars for me. It was perfectly fine. This gets a lot of respect for me for not just, doing the expected, in this book, and, not treading on some really problematic ground because of that. But overall, this was just fine for me. And then the first book that I read this month, and probably, definitely my favorite that I read, was This Thing Between Us by Gus Marino. This is another one I read for Goodreads Best of Horror 2021. I didn't realize when I was doing it this month. I just apparently plowed through that list this month, which is great. Means I don't have to get to more of them later on. I'm probably just gonna give you some spoilers. I think this is probably gonna be my favorite from the whole list. This was amazing. There have only been a couple of books this entire year that have really gotten me in my feelings and really made me cry. And for, any number of reasons, like The Between is another one of those. But it didn't hit me so hard in the feelings because it hit me so close to home. I just thought it told this beautiful story, and the characters were so real and so believable, and the ending was just so cumulative and just all this kind of stuff. This got me right in my feelings. This beautifully captured a lot of feelings that I have felt in this last year. Again, I talked about this a little bit in the mid-year freakout tag, but this last year, my husband and I have been dealing with a lot of grief, which is really fun. 10 of 10 would recommend. This really captured the sort of small moments in grief that I've just had to live in the last year. Like, there's this really great line about the way that people just try so hard to not... Whenever you're grieving, people want so much to help you and to do something to help make you feel better that it just becomes overwhelming. And it just feels like they've just forced themselves into your life at some point. And this discusses that so beautifully and talks about the ways that people will come at you to tell you about, like when you're grieving and other people are grieving as well for that same person, how they don't always approach you in a way that's centering you and your feelings. It centers them and theirs. And, just depending on how close you were to that person, it can sometimes be really agitating and it can be really frustrating. And I don't think I've ever read a book that so succinctly talked about that feeling in that moment of, I'm glad I can help you when you feel like you needed them to be there for you more than you needed to be there for them. It was so beautiful. This is such a great example as well of, a book that doesn't try to answer all its questions that it asks, and it doesn't try too hard to, to give you everything. It wants you to read it again, and it wants you to come to your own conclusions, even if you change conclusions every time. This was absolutely amazing, and it was so beautifully done, and it just, I can't say enough really positive things about this one, and yeah, I'll just say it again. I'm pretty sure this is going to end up being my top out of that list of Goodreads Best of Horror, because this is absolutely incredible and it's absolutely beautiful. So, okay, that's it. That's my June wrap up.